Today I'm going to examine how the Chesapeake region, specifically Virginia and Maryland, developed from fragile outposts into what historians call mature colonies. When we use the term mature colony, we mean a society that is no longer dependent on constant outside support for survival, but one that is able to govern itself, reproduce itself, and sustain its economy over generations. To frame our discussion, I'll walk through 6 key characteristics of maturity. 1. Effective governance. 2. Social stratification. 3. Emergence of slavery and or hardening of racial attitudes. 4. The development of a self-perpetuating population. 5. The rise of European-style agriculture. And finally, the shaping of the landscape and architecture in a more European style. We'll focus on Virginia and Maryland, the heart of the Upper South, or the Chesapeake region. These two colonies shared many similarities, especially in their reliance on tobacco, but they also differed in their origins, their political frameworks, and their religious life. So let's start off with effective governance. When we think about governance in the Chesapeake, we need to remember that Virginia and Maryland developed under 2 different models of colonial administration. Virginia became a royal colony in 1624, meaning the English crown exercised direct control. Governors were appointed by the king and had wide-ranging authority, enforcing laws, distributing land, and overseeing the militia. At the same time, Virginia was home to the House of Burgesses, created in 1619. This was the first representative assembly in English America. While its authority was often contested by the royal governor, it created an important precedent. Colonists expected some measure of self-government, even within a royal framework. Maryland, on the other hand, was formed in 1632 as a proprietary colony. Lord Baltimore, Cecilius Calvert, received a charter that gave him nearly feudal powers, the ability to appoint governors, distribute land, and even collect taxes. Maryland was intended as a refuge for English Catholics who faced persecution at home. In 1649, the colony passed the Act for Religious Toleration, which guaranteed freedom of worship to all Christians. While this was a groundbreaking step toward religious liberty, it excluded non-Christians and did not prevent religious violence. Protestants and Catholics clashed throughout the 17th century, at times erupting in open warfare. Both colonies reveal what effective governance meant in the 1600s, not necessarily democracy, but systems that created order, facilitated economic growth, and aligned the colonies with the broader goals of the English Empire. Now let's move to social stratification. As the Chesapeake matured, it developed clear social hierarchies. The headright system, first introduced in Virginia in 1618, granted 50 acres of land to anyone who paid for their own passage and an additional 50 acres for every servant or laborer they brought with them. Wealthy men quickly exploited this system, importing dozens of indentured servants and amassing huge estates. Maryland adopted similar practices. This system produced a stratified society. At the top stood the planter elite, men who controlled vast tracts of land, dominated tobacco production, and filled the seats of the colonial assemblies. Below them were smaller farmers and artisans. The majority of laborers were indentured servants, usually poor men from England or Ireland. They signed contracts for 4 to 7 years of work in exchange for passage, food, and shelter. Women's place in this society was complicated. Under the English common law of coverture, a married woman's legal identity was merged with her husband's. But in the Chesapeake, high mortality rates created unusual opportunities. Widows often inherited land and could wield economic power. Some remarried, consolidating wealth across households. In this way, social stratification intersected with gender in unique ways, producing a society that was unequal, but not without openings for mobility. Let's move on to emergence of slavery and or hardening of racial attitudes. At first, the Chesapeake's labor force relied primarily on indentured servants, but by the late 1600s, this system began to give way to slavery. The demand for labor was insatiable, fueled by the profitability of tobacco cultivation. At the same time, fewer Europeans were willing to sign indentured contracts, especially as economic opportunities in England improved. Planters turned increasingly to enslaved Africans. The laws reflected this transition. In Maryland in 1664, legislation declared that the children of enslaved women would also be enslaved for life, creating a hereditary system. In Virginia by 1705, the colony had codified comprehensive slave codes that made slavery a permanent, racialized institution. This shift represented more than just a change in labor supply. It hardened racial attitudes, creating a rigid divide between white and black residents. Freedom, property rights, and political participation were increasingly reserved for white men. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were reduced to property, and their status as such was reinforced both by law and custom. This transformation into a slave society, not just a society with slaves, was a defining characteristic of a mature Chesapeake colony. Now let's move to number 4, a self-perpetuating population. Perhaps the most critical marker of maturity was the emergence of self-perpetuating populations. Early on, both Virginia and Maryland were fragile, heavily dependent on new arrivals, but over time they developed the demographic structures needed to sustain themselves. Let's step back to the beginning. English settlers founded Jamestown in 1607, initially motivated by dreams of finding gold. What actually secured the colony's future was tobacco. But tobacco required extensive labor, and in the early years this labor came almost entirely from indentured servants. The problem was that these servants were overwhelmingly male. Scores of men crossed the Atlantic, but women were in short supply. This imbalance created instability. Men who completed their contracts often returned to England. Others left the colony altogether, marrying native women or moving into their villages, where they sometimes found more stability than Jamestown could provide. The lack of women meant that families were rare, and without families the colony could not sustain itself naturally. Meanwhile, word of Virginia's harsh conditions spread in England. Reports of disease, famine, and violence discouraged women from making the journey. During the starving time of 1609 to 1610, one colonist was even reported to have killed and cannibalized his wife. These stories convinced many women to stay away from Virginia. The Virginia Company realized that this imbalance threatened the colony's survival. Sir Edwin Sandys, treasurer of the company, argued before Parliament that bringing women would make the men more settled and less movable, and reduce the number who left the colony after completing their service. Religious leaders added their voices. Reverend William Simons preached in 1609 against intermarriage between English men and native women, warning that such a union endangered both souls and the colony's success. The solution was a deliberate campaign to recruit women. Contrary to stereotypes, these women were not desperate or undesirable. Many were carefully chosen. Of 38 women whose backgrounds are known, 8 had ties to the gentry. They came voluntarily, lured by the promise of opportunity. The company offered generous incentives: free passage, clothing, linens, beds, and even household goods. Women were given food and shelter until marriage, and men who wished to marry them had to reimburse the company with 125 to 150 pounds of tobacco. This ensured that only men of means could marry them and elevated the women's bargaining power. Because women were scarce, they could choose among their suitors. Some historians, like Marcia Zug, in Buying a Bride, an engaging history of mail-order matches, argues that women in the Chesapeake enjoyed greater independence than their English counterparts. High mortality rates actually enhanced their leverage. Widows often inherited property, and because marriages were short, many remarried, consolidating wealth and social standing. By the early 1700s, the demographic picture had changed dramatically. More women meant more families, and children born in Virginia and Maryland created a society that no longer relied solely on migration. Enslaved Africans also began to form a self-sustaining population. Laws ensured that children inherited the enslaved status of their mothers, while improved survival rates meant that enslaved communities could reproduce themselves. In short, the Chesapeake transformed from a precarious male frontier into a society anchored by households. This demographic stability was one of the clearest signs that Virginia and Maryland had become mature colonies. Now let's move on to number 5, European-style agriculture. Agriculture was the foundation of Chesapeake society, and tobacco was its lifeblood. The crop suited both the climate and the market. Demand in Europe was immense, and tobacco cultivation shaped every aspect of Chesapeake life. Plantations were laid out along rivers to facilitate transport, since tobacco was bulky and required direct access to ships. This system had several consequences. It concentrated wealth and power in the hands of the planter elite. It slowed urbanization, since planters could ship goods directly rather than relying on towns. It exhausted the soil, though, pushing planters westward and fueling conflict with native peoples. Though some diversification emerged in the 18th century, grains and livestock supplemented incomes, tobacco remained the core. It tied the Chesapeake Colonies firmly into the Atlantic economy and reinforced their dependence on enslaved labor. Now let's move to number 6, landscape and architecture. The Chesapeake landscape reflected its economic orientation. Unlike New England, with its clustered villages and town commons, the Chesapeake was defined by dispersed plantations. Farms were spread 2 or 3 miles apart, with 80% of households within half a mile of navigable water. Plantations functioned as self-contained worlds. The main house, barns, tobacco sheds, slave quarters, and private docks formed their own microeconomies. The dispersal showed the growth of institutions like churches and schools. The Anglican Church was the official faith, but there was a shortage of clergy, and the distance between the congregants made regular church life difficult. Towns grew slowly. Annapolis in Maryland and Williamsburg in Virginia eventually became important, but they were exceptions rather than the rule. The physical environment of the Chesapeake thus mirrored its society, rural, plantation-based, and oriented toward the export of tobacco. So, how did Virginia and Maryland become mature colonies? They developed effective governance through royal and proprietary frameworks that balanced order with local self-rule. They entrenched social stratification, concentrating wealth and power in planter elites while leaving servants, women, and the poor in subordinate roles. They shifted from indentured labor to racial slavery, codifying inequality in law. They cultivated a self-perpetuating population, first by importing women to stabilize family life, and later through the natural reproduction of both free and enslaved people. They built their economies on European-style agriculture centered on tobacco, and they reshaped the landscape and architecture into a world of plantations and waterways rather than towns and villages. Taken together, these developments mark the Chesapeake as not only surviving but thriving, though on foundations of inequality, coercion, and exploitation. By the early 18th century, Virginia and Maryland were no longer precarious experiments. They were permanent societies whose patterns of governance, economy, and race would echo across American history. I'm Dr. Lucas Wilder. This is History Gone Wilder, and I'll see you next time.